The gun was already pressed against Eva Rhodes's temple when she finally understood that the man she had trusted with her darkest secret had been the one hunting her all along. 3 years of running, 3 years of sleeping with one eye open and one boot already on the floor, and it had come down to this. A dusty crossroads at the edge of Redemption Valley, the late October wind cutting like a blade across the Colorado high country, and Deputy Marshal Calhoun Hayes pressing cold iron to her skull while she stood absolutely still and tried not to let him see her hands trembling. "Thought you were smart," Hayes said, and his voice carried that same slow, almost friendly drawl she had heard in Missouri when he was still a lawman and she was still a woman with a name nobody wanted to bury. "Thought disappearing 3 times would make you permanent. Doesn't work that way, Eva. You know whose money you took. You know what that means." "I didn't take anything." Her voice came out steadier than her heartbeat. "I witnessed something I wasn't supposed to witness, and you know the difference." "Doesn't matter what I know." He pressed the barrel harder. "Matters what Gerald Holt knows, and Gerald Holt says you walked out of that bank in St. Joseph with the ledger that names every judge and every marshal in his pocket. You bring that ledger back and maybe you see next spring." She could see the valley spread below them from this ridge, the first thin dusting of snow on the peaks above the tree line, the smoke rising from the chimney of a ranch house maybe a mile downslope. She had ridden into this valley 4 days ago telling herself it was just another stopping point, just another place to pass through. She had not planned to still be here. She had not planned on any of it. "Eva." That voice came from behind Hayes, and it was not loud and it was not rushed, and it carried the kind of authority that did not need to announce itself. Hayes went rigid. "I am going to ask you once," said John Wallace, and she heard the unmistakable double click of a rifle being cocked, "to take that weapon away from the lady's head." Hayes turned slowly, keeping her in front of him, pivoting so that she was still between him and the voice. She could see John now over the deputy's shoulder. He was on horseback, a tall chestnut mare, his Winchester leveled from a seat so steady it might have been carved from the same granite as the ridge beneath them. His hat was pushed back and his jaw was set, and his gray eyes were doing the calculation that men like him did quickly and without any visible emotion. "This is federal business," Hayes said. "Federal business doesn't press a gun to a woman's temple on my land," John replied. "Back away from her or the next sound you hear will be the last interesting thing that happens to you." She had not known him 4 days. She had not known anyone in this valley well enough to call them anything other than strangers. But John Wallace had been the first person in 3 seasons of running who had looked at her and not looked away, and the fact that he was here on this ridge at this exact moment, with that rifle and that level, steady voice, made something inside her chest do something it had not done in a very long time. It cracked open. Hayes made a calculation of his own. He was good with a pistol, but he was one man and John Wallace had a rifle already shouldered and 30 feet of empty space between them, and whatever Gerald Holt paid, it apparently did not cover those odds. He stepped back. He lowered the gun, and he looked at Eva with an expression that was not defeat so much as postponement. "This isn't done," he said. "No," she agreed quietly. "But you're going to ride back the way you came and you're going to tell Gerald Holt that what he's looking for doesn't exist anymore. You're going to tell him the ledger burned. You're going to tell him Eva Rhodes is dead." Hayes looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at John and the rifle. Then he mounted his horse and rode north without another word. She stood on the ridge until the sound of his horse faded, and then her legs gave out beneath her, not dramatically, not in a swoon, just a slow, exhausted folding at the knees, and she sat down in the dry November grass and pressed her palms flat against the cold earth and breathed. John Wallace dismounted. He came and crouched beside her. He did not touch her. He did not offer any of the things men offered when they wanted something in return. He just waited, the way a man waits who has learned that sometimes the most useful thing you can do for a person is give them silence. "Thank you," she finally said. "You want to tell me what that was about?" he asked. She looked at him. 3 years of careful lying, 3 years of half-truths and necessary misdirections, and she was so tired of all of it that the truth felt almost light by comparison. "Not out here," she said. "But yes, I'll tell you everything." She had arrived in Redemption Valley on a gray Thursday morning in late October of 1878, riding a brown mare named Dust that she had purchased in Pueblo with the last of a particular set of funds she tried not to think about too carefully. The valley sat in the southwestern corner of Colorado Territory, cradled between two arms of the Rockies and fed by the Animas River's upper tributaries, and it had the quality that certain places in the West had of appearing to exist slightly outside of ordinary time, as though the mountains had pressed their palms together and held this pocket of land in a kind of suspension. She had not chosen it deliberately. She had been choosing places the way she had been choosing everything for 3 seasons, at random, by instinct, by the simple principle of putting miles between herself and the last place she had been. The first season had been summer, the summer of 1876, when she had ridden out of St. Joseph, Missouri with nothing but a saddlebag, a small leather-wrapped package she guarded more fiercely than her own life, and the memory of a man named Gerald Holt standing over the body of Judge Clarence Whitmore and saying with perfect calm that the judge had suffered a most unfortunate cardiac event. She had been in the hallway. She had seen his hands around the judge's throat. She had seen the ledger on the desk, the one in which the judge had been meticulously recording every payment from Holt's operation, every name, every date, every dollar amount that had kept a dozen men in positions of power and kept Gerald Holt himself untouchable. And she had done something that she still was not entirely certain was brave or simply desperate. She had taken the ledger. She had tucked it under her arm and walked out of that building in the 5 seconds between Holt setting the body down and turning to retrieve it himself. By the time Holt had realized what was missing, she was already riding. The second season had been the autumn and winter of 1876 into 1877, spent in Dodge City, Kansas, working as a seamstress under the name Clara Webb, and keeping the ledger sewn into the lining of a winter coat that never left her sight. Dodge City had been rough and loud, and exactly the kind of place where a woman who kept to herself attracted no particular notice. But in March of 1877, she had been in the dry goods store when a man came in asking questions, and the questions were specific enough that she had left that same afternoon with nothing but the coat. The third season had been the spring and summer and early autumn of 1877, spent moving through New Mexico Territory, through Santa Fe and Taos, and a dozen smaller settlements, never staying more than 3 weeks anywhere, learning to read the way strangers looked at her, learning the particular quality of attention that meant someone had been asking around. She had gotten very good at disappearing. She had also gotten very lonely in a way that had moved past ache into something more like numbness, the way a limb gets after it has been pressed against something cold for too long. And then it was 1878 and she was still running, and the seasons kept coming whether she was ready for them or not, and she had ridden into Redemption Valley mostly because her horse was tired and her supplies were low and the mountains had been promising snow for a week. The town itself was called Garnet Creek, named for the small gemstones that turned up occasionally in the river gravel. It had a main street with a general store, a livery, a saloon that doubled as a hotel, a small church, and a doctor's office. It had perhaps 300 residents at any given time, more in summer when the mining camps in the upper valley were active, fewer in winter when the passes closed. It was the kind of town that had seen enough transients to be neither particularly welcoming nor particularly suspicious, which suited her exactly. She had ridden in on that gray Thursday and gone straight to the livery to see to Dust, and the man who had come out to take the horse was named Thomas Briggs, who was approximately 60 years old and had the weathered, unhurried quality of someone who had made peace with everything the world had thrown at him. He had looked at the horse carefully, checked her shoes without being asked, and said that she looked like a good animal who had been ridden hard. "She has been," Eva said, "passing through." He asked, which was not an accusatory question here, just a practical one. "For now," she said, which was the most honest thing she had said to a stranger in 2 years. She had taken a room at the saloon, which was run by a woman named Harriet Dole, a broad-shouldered widow of 40 who ran the establishment with the brisk efficiency of someone who had learned not to tolerate nonsense from anyone. Harriet had given her a key and a meal, and not asked a single question about where she had come from, which Eva appreciated more than she could express. She had spent the first 2 days telling herself she was just waiting out the weather, watching the sky for the snow that kept threatening and never quite arriving, keeping dust rested and her own bags packed. She had walked the town's single main street, mapped the exits, identified the marshal's office, noted that the current marshal was a young man named Potts who looked to be about 25 and very proud of his badge. It was on the 3rd day that she had met John Wallace. She had been in the general store, run by a soft-spoken man named Amos Carr, purchasing flour and coffee and a new pair of work gloves, the kind that had real leather palms because her old pair had finally given out. She had been standing at the counter when the door opened, and a man came in carrying a broken harness and talking to Amos Carr about whether he had any good rivets, and she had not looked up immediately because she had trained herself not to look up at every person who entered a room, because it made you look nervous. But then Amos Carr had said, "Morning, John," in the particular warm way people said the names of people they genuinely respected, and she had looked up. John Wallace was perhaps 32 or 33, she thought, though the western sun could add years to a face, and she had learned to adjust for that. He was tall, with the lean, capable build of a man who worked hard land every day and not a movement of whose was wasted. His hair was dark brown, just long enough to curl slightly where it touched his collar, and his eyes, when they landed on her as he crossed to the counter, were a shade of gray that she associated with Colorado winter sky just before the clouds opened up. He had looked at her the way she described, directly, and without any of the many varieties of male appraisal she had learned to catalog and deflect. Not as though he was measuring her worth or calculating an angle, just as though he was seeing her. "Pardon me," he said, because he needed to reach past her to show Amos the broken harness fitting, and when he said it his voice was the same unhurried, grounded quality that she would hear later on the ridge. "Of course," she said. They had not spoken beyond that. He had concluded his business with Amos and bought his rivets and left, and she had finished her purchases and walked back to the saloon and stood at her window looking at the mountains and told herself firmly that there was nothing notable about a polite man in a general store. But the next morning she had been down at the river, just past the edge of town where the cottonwoods grew thick and the water ran clear over flat stones, sitting and watching the current in the way she sometimes did when she needed to quiet the noise in her head, and John Wallace had appeared on horseback on the opposite bank, checking something in the river. And when he looked up and saw her, he had raised 2 fingers from his brim in acknowledgement without any of the intrusive friendliness that some men considered their right. She had raised her hand back. He had ridden on. She had thought about him for the rest of the day, which she considered a problem. On the 4th day, Hayes had arrived. She had been eating breakfast in the saloon's small dining room when she had seen the gray horse outside and recognized the brand as a U.S. Marshal Service horse before she even saw the rider. She had been up the stairs and out the back window within 30 seconds, moving by the particular automatic terror that had replaced ordinary fear response somewhere in her 2nd season of running. She had gone straight to the livery, had dust saddled in under 3 minutes, and had ridden up the ridge trail at the back of the valley with no clear plan beyond the simple logic of elevation and distance. But Hayes had been faster than she'd expected, or had known the valley better than she'd assumed, and he had been waiting at the crossroads with the gun already in his hand. And John Wallace had been checking his fence line when he heard voices that carried the particular timbre of threat, and he had come with his rifle, and here they were. She told him most of this sitting on the ridge as the temperature dropped, and the first real flakes of snow began to fall, dusting the dry grass around them white. She told him about the judge and the ledger, and the 3 years of running. She did not tell him exactly where the ledger was, not because she didn't trust him, but because she had learned to release information in stages to give herself room to reassess. He listened without interrupting, which was something. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, watching the snowflakes settle on the sleeve of his coat. "Gerald Holt," he said finally. "I've heard that name. Most lawmen in Missouri and Kansas have," she said. "He's got reach," John said. It was not a question. "He has reach," she confirmed, "which is how he's been able to keep sending people after me for 3 years without anyone stopping him. The ledger could stop him. The ledger could put him and a dozen others in federal prison for the rest of their lives," she said, "including the men who have been helping him find me." John turned and looked at her then with an expression she could not entirely read, something careful and assessing behind the surface directness. "Why haven't you used it?" he asked. 3 years is a long time to carry something like that without sending it somewhere. It was a fair question. It was the question she had asked herself 1,000 times in the dark of 100 different rooms. "Because every time I've gotten close enough to trust someone with it," she said carefully, "something has happened to make me understand that the trust was misplaced. Holt's money is persuasive, and I don't know enough about who is already bought and who isn't to risk it through normal channels." She looked at her hands. "I was waiting until I found someone I was sure of." The wind picked up and drove the snow sideways for a moment, and they both turned their faces into it automatically, and then it settled again. "Come to the ranch," he said. "My housekeeper, Margaret, is there, and you'll have your own room. You can think about what you want to do next, and you won't be sitting in the saloon where Hayes can find you again." She looked at him. "You don't know me." "I know you well enough," he said, and the simplicity of it was either the most naive thing she had ever heard or the most grounded. She thought about it for the length of 3 of her own heartbeats. "All right," she said. The Wallace Ranch sat in the lower third of the valley where the land leveled out, and the river ran through it in broad, shallow curves. It was not the largest spread she had seen, and not the most prosperous looking from the outside, but it had the quality of a place that had been built and maintained by someone who intended to stay, who had put thought into how the structures related to each other, and to the land, who had chosen this particular piece of ground with deliberate affection. The main house was timber and stone, 2 stories, with a wide porch that ran the full length of the front face and looked out across the valley toward the western peaks. There was a barn, a smaller outbuilding that served as a workshop, a chicken coop, and a kitchen garden that was mostly put to bed for the winter. There were 3 ranch hands who worked year-round, men named Pete, Carver, and an older Mexican man named Santos who had been on this land longer than the ranch house itself. Margaret Hooper was John's housekeeper, a compact woman in her late 50s with sharp brown eyes and an air of having seen everything and judged only half of it. She received Eva with the brisk practicality of someone who kept a house and intended to keep it well regardless of how many unexpected guests appeared during snowstorms. "Room at the top of the stairs on the left," Margaret said, already moving toward the kitchen. "Supper's in an hour. I'll need to know if you have any sensitivities." "I don't," Eva said. "Good, sit anywhere." She was given the room at the top of the stairs on the left. It was clean and simple, with a bed with a heavy quilt, a washstand, a small writing desk, and a window that looked out over the porch roof and across the valley. She sat on the edge of the bed and took the ledger from inside her coat and held it in her hands for a moment. It was small, smaller than people probably imagined when they thought of a document that had driven 3 years of running. Leather-bound, perhaps 4 inches by 6, the pages close-written in the judge's careful hand. A small, quiet, devastating thing. She put it under the mattress, and then immediately felt that was too obvious and moved it to the inside of her extra boot, and then went downstairs to supper. Supper at the Wallace Ranch was served at a long kitchen table with everyone together, Margaret and Pete and Carver and Santos, and John at the head, and now Eva at the foot. This was, she gathered, simply how things were done here, and no one found it remarkable. The food was plain and plentiful, venison stew and cornbread, and the conversation moved around the table with the easy pragmatism of people who worked the same land and shared the same daily concerns. Pete asked if she was planning to stay through the winter. The question was direct but not unfriendly. "I'm not sure yet," she said. "You'd be smart to," Carver said. "That first pass will be snowed in within 2 weeks." "He's right," Santos said. He had a quiet, measured way of speaking, and he directed this at her without any preamble. "The valley seals up by December mostly. Safer to wait for spring." John said nothing, but she caught him watching her across the table with that same unhurried attention, and she felt the awareness of it all the way to her breastbone. That night she lay awake in the room at the top of the stairs and listened to the wind work itself into the valley and thought about what Hayes had said. He would go back to Holt. He would report where she was, or at least the general region, and Holt would send someone else or come himself, or wait until spring and let the passes do his work for him. She was not safe here any more than she had been safe in Dodge City or Santa Fe. She had simply exchanged one temporary shelter for another. And yet something in her, some exhausted, battered part that had been asking the same questions for 3 years without getting any answers, was sitting quietly for the first time and listening to the sound of the wind and the creak of timber, and not immediately cataloging the distance to the nearest exit. She was up before dawn and dressed and in the kitchen before Margaret appeared, which earned her a raised eyebrow and what she thought might be a point of respect. "Coffee's in the blue tin," Margaret said. "Water's already heated." She made the coffee and stood at the kitchen window and watched the valley come awake in the gray pre-dawn light, the shapes of the mountains surfacing from darkness, and something about the scale of it, the way the peaks held the sky, and the river ran through the middle of everything regardless of what was happening on its banks, made her feel something she identified only slowly as small. Not in a diminishing way. In the way that sometimes, when you are carrying something very heavy for a very long time, the experience of something vast and unhurried can make you feel briefly that you are not alone in the universe. She heard boots on the stairs, and John came into the kitchen, stopped when he saw her, and then came forward without adjusting his expression. "You sleep?" he asked. "Some," she said. "Coffee?" "Thank you." She poured, and he took the cup and stood beside her at the window, and for a few minutes they looked at the valley together without speaking, and it was the most comfortable silence she had inhabited in 3 years. "I want to tell you the rest of it," she said. "The part I didn't tell you on the ridge." "All right." She told him about the ledger. She told him what was in it. She told him about the judge, whose name was Clarence Whitmore, who had been a federal circuit court judge in western Missouri, and who had started taking Holt's money in 1872 when his wife was ill, and the medical bills were swallowing everything he owned, and who had, she believed, genuinely come to regret it, which was why he had been keeping the ledger in the first place. Compiling his own evidence against himself and everyone else as some kind of preparation for a reckoning he never got to see through. He was going to turn it over, she said. I don't know to whom, but he was building towards something, and Holt found out. "How do you know all this?" John asked. "Because I was his clerk," she said. "I worked for Judge Whitmore for 2 years. He trusted me more than he should have, or perhaps exactly as much as he intended to, depending on how you look at it. I think he knew that if anything happened to him, I would do something with what I knew." She paused. "I've just taken 3 years to work out what that something should be." John set his coffee down and turned to look at her fully, that direct, unguarded attention, and she made herself hold it. "Do you trust me?" he asked. The question landed exactly as questions land when they mean more than they literally say. "I don't know yet," she said. "I'd like to." Something shifted at the edge of his expression, not quite a smile, more like the acknowledgement of something important. "Fair," he said. Over the following 2 weeks, the snow came properly, and the upper passes closed, and the valley pulled its seasonal borders around itself. And Eva Rhodes found herself moving from the status of guest to something that didn't have a specific name, but felt like belonging in a way she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a very long time. She helped Margaret with the household work, not because anyone expected her to, but because she needed to move and to be useful, and because Margaret's company, which was dry and practical and unexpectedly funny, was something she found she wanted. She helped Carver and Pete with the horses when the weather allowed, and found herself talking to Santos in the evening sometimes, when he sat on the covered part of the porch even in the cold, smoking his pipe and watching the mountains. Santos was Navajo by birth, though his life had taken him far from his origins in ways he described without bitterness, simply as the record of events that had occurred. He had worked this land for 11 years, first for John's father who had built the original homestead, and then for John who had expanded it. He spoke about John with the specific, non-effusive regard that people reserve for those they genuinely respect. "He is a good man," Santos said one evening, not in the manner of someone making a pronouncement, but in the way you state a thing that is simply true. His father was hard, not cruel but hard. John chose to be different. "How did he end up here?" she asked. "The valley, I mean." "His father came for the land in 1865. John came back for it in 1873 after his father died. He had been working cattle in Texas before that." Santos drew on his pipe. He could have sold the land. Several men offered him good prices. He chose to stay. She thought about that, the choosing to stay. "He was engaged once," Santos said with the matter-of-fact calm that made her suddenly pay closer attention. "A woman named Helen from Durango. She decided the valley was too remote. That was 1875. He has not courted anyone since." She said nothing, but she felt the shape of the information settle into her understanding of John Wallace and add something to it. She began riding out with him in the mornings, once the weather permitted short excursions, helping check the fences that enclosed his winter pastures and the cattle that had been moved to the lower valley. It was work she knew from her childhood in Ohio, where her father had kept a small farm, and the familiar rhythms of it, the cold air and the creak of saddle leather and the particular quality of a morning in high country, did something to the tight knot she had been carrying in her chest. They talked. Not strategically, not with the careful, measured disclosure she had been practicing for 3 years, but just talked, the way people do when they are doing something physical together, and the work gives the conversation a frame that makes honesty easier. She told him about Ohio and her father's farm and her mother, who had been a school teacher, and had taught her to read before she was 4 and to love books in a way that had made her strange among her peers and not care at all. She told him about going to St. Joseph at 22 to find work, about how she had gotten the clerk position with Judge Whitmore through a recommendation from a professor she had studied law under for 2 semesters before running out of money, which was as far as a woman could reasonably expect to get in 1874 in her pursuit of the law. "You wanted to be a lawyer?" he asked. "I wanted to understand how the law worked," she said. "I understood that I couldn't practice it. But I wanted to know it well enough that nobody could use my ignorance of it against me." She paused, checking the fence wire, which turned out to be prescient. He told her about Texas, about 5 years working cattle drives that went from the southern ranches up to the railheads in Kansas, about the particular brutal loneliness of that work, and the specific companionship it also generated among men who spent months together in difficult conditions. He told her about his father, Edmund Wallace, who had been a complicated man, a veteran of the war who had brought his damage home with him and distributed it unevenly among the people around him, but who had also had a vision for this valley and a stubbornness about it that John had, over time and with some effort, come to understand as a kind of love. "He wasn't good at being gentle," John said. But he was good at being here, at not leaving. I think that was how he showed what mattered to him. She looked at him across the fence line. And you, she asked, are you good at being gentle? He held her gaze. I'm working on it. The first time he touched her deliberately was an accident that was not entirely an accident. They were in the barn on a Thursday afternoon in mid-November, sorting through winter tack, and she reached for a bridle on the same hook at the same moment he did, and their hands met in the air, and neither of them moved away immediately. It lasted perhaps 5 seconds, his hand over hers, both of them looking at the bridle hook and then at each other. And then she stepped back and they both continued with what they were doing, and no one said anything about it. But the air in the barn had changed and they both knew it. That night she lay awake for a long time thinking about touch as a concept, about how long it had been since anyone had touched her with any warmth at all, about what it meant that her first response had been not alarm, but something closer to the sensation of warm water on cold hands. It was Margaret, with her characteristic bluntness, who finally made the subtext text. Eva was helping peel potatoes in the kitchen 3 days later when Margaret said, without preamble or introduction, "He is trying not to make you uncomfortable." Eva kept peeling. "I know. He's been watching you the way a man watches something he's afraid of frightening away." Margaret cut a potato with efficient precision. "I thought you should know that in case you've been misreading it as indifference." "I haven't," Eva said. "Good." Margaret moved on to the next potato. "I also think you should know that this is not the kind of house where things are taken lightly. John doesn't do things lightly. It's not in him." Eva thought about that for the rest of the afternoon, and she thought about it while she helped clear the table after supper, and she thought about it while she sat at the small desk in her room and wrote in the journal she had been keeping since the beginning of her running, the record of days and places and people that she kept partly as evidence and partly as a way of proving to herself that she had existed. She wrote, "I am afraid of wanting to stay." Then she closed the journal and looked out the window at the snow-covered valley and acknowledged that this fear, unlike the fear that had been driving her for 3 years, was one she had a choice about. She sought him out the next morning. He was in the workshop, fitting a new wooden handle to a hammer, the small, precise work of a man who believed in maintaining things. She came and stood in the doorway and he looked up. "Can I talk to you?" she asked. "Always," he said, and set the hammer down. She crossed the threshold and stood in the warm, wood-scented air of the workshop and said, "I have been running for 3 years and I have been very good at it. And I have kept myself safe by not trusting anyone and not staying anywhere and not wanting anything I couldn't carry. And I need you to understand that before I say anything else, because it is relevant to why I am finding this difficult." He waited. "I don't think Hayes is the last person Holt will send," she said. "I think when the passes open in spring, there will be someone else. And I need to make a decision before then about whether I am going to keep running or whether I am going to stop and fight. And I have been thinking about those options for 3 weeks, and what I keep coming back to is that the reason I keep postponing the decision is that stopping would require trusting someone else with the ledger and with the plan, and I haven't been willing to do that." She looked at him directly. "Until now." He stood very still. "I want to trust you," she said. "I already do, more than I've trusted anyone in 3 years. And I am aware that could be dangerous, that Holt has gotten to people who seemed trustworthy before. But I also know that at some point you have to decide whether you're going to live your life or just preserve it, and those are different things." She exhaled slowly. "So I'm asking, if I stay here and we try to use the ledger to end this properly, through federal channels or through someone untouched by Holt's money, will you help me?" John looked at her for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was steady and low. "I've known from the day I pulled that marshal off you that whatever this was, I was already in it," he said. "Yes, I'll help you, whatever it takes." She had not expected the relief to be physical, had not expected her whole body to release something it had been holding for months, and when her eyes filled, she looked away briefly and pressed her thumb hard against the inside of her wrist the way she had learned to do when she needed to stay composed. "There's something else," she said, still looking at the wall. "Tell me." She turned back. "I don't want to be just a problem you're helping solve. I want to know if we are something else as well." The light in the workshop was gray and warm, and his face when he looked at her had the quality of someone who has been waiting for something for a long time and is being very careful not to reach for it too fast. "Eva," he said quietly. "Yes, we are something else as well." She crossed the workshop and he met her halfway, and when he took her face in his hands, she felt the steadiness of him all the way through, the same groundedness that had been in his voice on the ridge, the same quality of someone who had decided where he stood and was standing there. He kissed her carefully, with restraint that she understood was consideration rather than reluctance, and she reached up and put her hands over his and kissed him back without restraint at all, because she was tired of restraint and tired of running, and this particular thing, was one she was willing to run toward instead. When they stepped back from each other, the workshop was still the same gray and warm, and the hammer was still on the bench, and outside the mountains were still holding the valley, and the world had shifted by a degree that felt small from the outside and enormous from the inside. "All right," he said. His voice had the quality of something new in it. "All right," she agreed. The planning took the better part of 2 weeks, conducted in the evenings around the kitchen table when the ranch hands had gone to their bunkhouse, and Margaret sat at the far end knitting with the deliberate lack of interest of someone paying close attention. The federal circuit that covered southwestern Colorado territory was the 8th Circuit, and the resident judge was a man named Arthur Benson who sat in Denver, and who, John said, had a reputation as incorruptible. He had been appointed in 1876 and was known to have declined Holt's various approaches, which was how John knew his name. The question was getting the ledger to Benson without it being intercepted, and without either Eva or John being stopped first. "There's a federal postal agent who runs through Durango every 2 weeks, Santos said one evening. He had been invited into the conversation without ceremony, because he was the person in the valley with the widest network of knowledge. Man named Calloway. He takes sealed federal documents to Denver directly. He was appointed last year. He's new enough that Holt's people haven't gotten to him yet." "How do you know that?" Eva asked. "Because I talk to people," Santos said simply. "Can you get a message to Calloway without it being obvious?" John asked. Santos looked at him with the expression of someone who has been solving problems quietly for 11 years. "Yes." They spent 3 evenings writing the letter that would accompany the ledger. Eva wrote the factual account of what she had witnessed, signed and dated, with the specific detail that would make it legally actionable. John wrote a separate statement as a witness to the confrontation with Hayes on the ridge, which established that Holt had current active agents in the field. Margaret, without being asked, wrote a brief addendum in her precise hand, noting that she was a resident of Garnet Creek who could confirm certain dates and details if required, and then went back to her knitting without comment. They sealed the ledger and the letters inside a leather document pouch and sent it with Santos when he rode to Durango on what appeared to be a routine supply run in early December. The waiting was the hardest part. Eva had found, in the course of the planning and the work, and the building of something alongside John that felt more solid with every passing day, that she had developed an unfamiliar relationship with the future, one in which it seemed to have specific contents rather than just the abstract possibility of continued running. But the waiting for word back from Denver, waiting to know whether the ledger had arrived, whether Benson would act on it, whether Holt had enough forewarning to move against it, was its own kind of trial. She and John had settled into something that had a shape now. He rode with her in the mornings. They ate together at the long table. In the evenings they sat by the fire in the main room, sometimes talking, sometimes reading, and she had stopped thinking about the distance to the nearest exit when she was in a room with him, and had started thinking instead about how his voice sounded when he was telling a story he found funny, or the specific quality of attention he brought to things, the way he listened, as though what you were saying was the only thing currently happening in the universe. He was careful with her in the way that someone is careful when they understand the weight of what they are handling, but he was not tentative. He brought her coffee without being asked, because he had learned how she took it. He stood close when they were working together. He touched her shoulder when he passed behind her at the table, small things that accumulated into the particular texture of being known. One evening in mid-December, when the snow was thick outside and the fire was high and Margaret had gone to bed, he said, "Tell me about before all of it, before St. Joseph. Tell me about who you were when you were a girl." No one had asked her that in 3 years, perhaps longer. She told him about the farm in Ohio, about her mother's kitchen, which smelled like wood smoke and bread, and the particular ink of the books her mother kept on a shelf above the stove, about her father, who was a gentle, methodical man who called her little lawyer when she was small because she argued every point as though the outcome mattered, about the specific quality of Ohio summer, the heaviness of the air and the green of the corn, and the sound of the creek behind the house. Her parents were gone now. Her mother had died of fever in the winter of 1873, and her father had followed her 3 months later in what the doctor called heart failure, and what Eva privately believed was something closer to will failure. She had gone to St. Joseph shortly after that, seeking the position with Judge Whitmore, wanting to do something with what she had built and learned. "Were you happy?" John asked. "Before," she thought about it honestly. "I was purposeful," she said. "I had direction and I believed in what I was doing. Whether that was happiness, I'm not sure I knew the difference. And now," she looked at the fire and then at him, "I think I'm learning the difference." He reached across and took her hand where it rested on the arm of the chair, and she turned her palm up and held his, and they sat like that in the firelight while the wind worked at the windows, and she understood that this was what stopping felt like. Not the absence of motion, but the presence of something worth staying for. Word came from Santos on December 21st, the winter solstice, when he returned from a second trip to Durango carrying a sealed letter from Judge Arthur Benson's office in Denver. The letter was addressed formally to Eva Rhodes, care of John Wallace, Redemption Valley, Colorado Territory, and it said that the ledger had been received and authenticated, that a federal investigation was underway, that warrants had been issued for Gerald Holt and for 11 named associates including Deputy Marshal Calhoun Hayes, and that Eva Rhodes was released from any and all liability in connection with the Whitmore case, her actions being specifically and formally acknowledged as those of a material witness acting in the public interest. She read it 3 times at the kitchen table while John stood at the window and Margaret stood at the stove pretending to stir something. When she set it down, her hands were completely steady for the first time in 3 years. "It's done," she said. John turned from the window and she stood up and he crossed the kitchen in 4 strides, and when he put his arms around her, she pressed her face against the warmth of his chest and let herself be held without calculating anything at all. Margaret stirred her pot. Santos, in the doorway, said quietly, "Good." Christmas in Redemption Valley came with 6 inches of fresh snow and the particular stillness that deep cold puts on a landscape, the way everything becomes very clear and very white, and the mountains look closer. Harriet Dole organized a community gathering at the saloon, which was redecorated for the occasion with pine boughs and candles, and half the valley came in from their ranches and farms and small claims to stand in the warm, lit space and drink cider and eat Harriet's remarkable apple cake and talk about the winter and the spring to come. Eva came with John and stood beside him in a way she had not stood beside anyone in years, consciously, by choice, without calculating what the position implied. He stood close enough that their shoulders touched, and he brought her cider and introduced her to people she hadn't met, ranchers and farmers and the schoolteacher and the doctor, and she found herself shaking hands and having conversations about entirely ordinary things, and realizing with a small shock that she was not performing normalcy, but inhabiting it. Marshal Potts was there, looking young and earnest, and he told her that he had received a federal communication confirming that Hayes had been arrested in Kansas City 2 weeks prior, and that the warrants were proceeding through the courts instant. Joseph and his face showed the slight awe of a young lawman who had just witnessed something large and significant happen at the edge of his jurisdiction. "You're safe here," he said, which was a simple and direct thing and clearly meant with genuine warmth. "I know," she said, and realized she had known it for several weeks already. John took her home through the snow in the wagon, the horses going steady through the drifts, the valley dark and silver around them, and when she leaned her head against his shoulder partway home, he let her and put his arm around her and drove one-handed without comment. In February, when the snow was deepest and the valley most completely sealed from the outside world, he asked her to marry him. He did it at the river, which had been their place in whatever unspoken way places become ours. The water ran dark and cold between ice-edged banks, and the sky was that particular Colorado blue that only comes in deep winter, so saturated it looked almost painted. And they had been walking the river path that she had walked alone in the autumn, and that they had begun walking together in the weeks after the ledger was sent. He stopped walking and she stopped beside him, and when she turned to look at him, he was already looking at her with that direct, unhurried attention. "I know 3 months is not long," he said. "I know you have spent 3 years not being certain of anything. I know you were considering whether to stay or go, and that the question was still open when you arrived here. I'm not asking because the question has been settled for you by circumstances. I'm asking because I want you here, specifically here for as long as time runs, and I want to know if you want the same thing." She had thought, once early in their proximity, that she would need more time to be sure. She had thought that the damage of the running years would take longer to undo, that she would need seasons rather than weeks to rebuild the capacity for this. She had been wrong, or rather, she had underestimated what happens when the right place and the right person occur at the same time, which is that healing is not always slow. "Yes," she said, "I want the same thing." He produced a ring from his coat pocket, a simple gold band with a small garnet set in it, the color of the valley's namesake stones, and when he put it on her finger in the cold winter light, she felt it as a declaration in both directions, not just his, but hers. A declaration that she had arrived somewhere and intended to stay. She kissed him with the river running beside them, and the mountains watching from every horizon, and the cold air carrying the particular sweetness of wood smoke from the valley below. They were married in March, when the first suggestion of spring was beginning to work at the lower edges of the snowpack, and the cottonwoods by the river were showing the first faint haze of new leaves. The ceremony was held in the little church in Garnet Creek, performed by a preacher who traveled the circuit through the valley twice yearly and who happened to be present, and the whole community came because the community was that size and that kind. Harriet Dole baked the wedding cake. Santos wore his best coat and stood at the back with his arms folded and the expression of a man whose judgments had been confirmed. Margaret wore a hat she had not worn in years and stood in the front row and did not cry, though her face when Eva came down the makeshift aisle in a blue dress she had made herself from fabric from Amos Carr's store, was the face of someone exercising considerable self-discipline. Eva walked toward John, and John walked toward Eva, and they met in the middle of the church in front of a community that had known one of them for years and the other for months, and seemed to regard the combination as simply right. "I, John Wallace, take you, Eva Rhodes, to be my wife," he said, and the solemnness and the joy in his voice were not in conflict with each other at all. "To have and to hold, to honor and protect and walk beside for all the days I have. And I, Eva Rhodes," she said, and her voice was clear and steady and wholly without reservation, "take you, John Wallace, to be my husband, to build with and stay with and trust completely, for all the days I have." The preacher pronounced them married, and John kissed her with a gentleness that had warmth all the way through it, and someone in the back of the church, She suspected it was Pete, let out a whoop that startled the birds from the rafters. Spring opened the valley like a letter being read. The snow retreated up the slopes, and the river ran high and fast with snowmelt, and the pastures came green in the particular urgent green of Colorado spring, and the cattle moved back to the upper grazing land, and the whole enterprise of the valley renewed itself with the seasonal confidence of a place that knew what it was doing. Eva was not precisely idle. She had begun keeping the ranch's accounts, which had previously been kept by John in a ledger of the domestic rather than damning variety, done in the evenings with a competence she admired, but a precision that left something to be desired. She brought her 2 years of legal clerking to bear on the books, and the result was a system considerably more organized than the previous one. She also began teaching, informally at first, and then with gathering purpose. There were 8 children in the valley whose schooling was intermittent, dependent on the circuit teacher who came twice yearly, and on whatever parents could manage between farming seasons. Eva had her mother's books still, packed through 3 years of running, slightly battered but intact, and she set up a school in the church 2 mornings a week that grew by spring's end to 12 students ranging in age from 6 to 14. John watched this development with an expression that she had learned to identify as his particular kind of deep pleasure, the kind he kept quiet because he hadn't grown up in a family where pleasure was expressed easily. One evening in April, when they were sitting on the porch in the first warmth of the year watching the last light leave the peaks, he said, "You know you don't have to justify being here by being useful." She looked at him. "I know that." "Do you?" She thought about it honestly. "I'm still learning that," she said. "The teaching isn't justification, it's something I want to do. But you're right that I'm still adjusting to the idea that wanting to do something is sufficient reason." He took her hand. "It is." She leaned against his shoulder. "I know. The letter from Judge Benson's office came in May, a final communication confirming that Gerald Holt had been convicted on 17 counts of bribery, coercion, and conspiracy, and had been sentenced to 20 years in the federal penitentiary in Kansas City. 8 associates had been convicted alongside him, including Calhoun Hayes, who had received 12 years. 4 others were in the process of being tried. The letter formally closed Eva's case and commended her, in the formal, particular language of federal legal documentation, for her courage and persistence in preserving material evidence under adverse circumstances. She read it at the kitchen table and then handed it to John and went and stood at the window. He read it and came and stood behind her and put his hands on her shoulders. "It's over," he said. "I know," she said. "How does that feel?" She was quiet for a moment, watching the valley in its May beauty, the wildflowers coming up along the river bank, the cattle small and dark on the distant slopes, the mountains standing in their permanent, patient endurance. "Like the first morning you wake up after a long illness," she said. "You know that something is gone that was taking up all the space, and you're not sure yet what the space will become, but the space itself is the best thing." He turned her toward him gently, and she turned and looked at him, this man who had come with his rifle to a ridge and handed her the first real safety she had felt in years. "I love you," she said. It was the first time she had said it. She had felt it for months, but the saying of it had felt like the last remaining act of full trust, the one she had been saving. His face when she said it was something she thought she would remember for all the rest of her life, that specific quality of joy that lands on a person who has been patient and hopeful and not quite certain. "I love you, Eva," he said. "I have since sometime in November, I think, maybe October." She laughed, and it was a real laugh, not the polite version she had been managing for 3 years, but the deeper kind that comes from somewhere below the sternum and that she had not had reason to deploy in a very long time. "October," she said. "When?" "When you were standing in Amos Carr's store and you didn't look up when I came in," he said. "I couldn't explain why at the time." "Because I was a professional fugitive and I was trained not to make eye contact with strangers," she said. "Yes, well," he said. "I didn't know that part." She laughed again, and he was smiling, which was its own particular warmth, and she put her arms around him there in the kitchen with the May sun coming through the windows and the valley going about its beautiful business outside, and she held on. The summer of 1879 was the best summer Eva could remember, which was not a diminishment of any previous summer, but rather a reflection of how specific and particular this one was, how it had the quality of something she was fully present for rather than moving through. She expanded the school to 3 mornings a week and sent a letter to the Territorial Education Office in Denver requesting formal recognition, which would come with a small budget for books and materials. Amos Carr donated a set of primer readers from his personal stock, which touched her more than she could easily express. The children, ranging now from 6 to 15, came with the various attitudes of children toward learning, some avid and some resistant, and she found she had patience for all of them that she had not known she possessed. John spent the summer expanding the cattle operation, buying 20 additional head at the spring drive, and negotiating grazing rights on a section of Upper Valley land that had been unclaimed. He did this with the steady, purposeful energy of a man building something for a future he was confident in, and she found herself watching him with that thought. He was building for a future he was confident in, and she was part of that future, and the idea of it was not frightening anymore. They rode together most mornings early, before the ranch work made other demands, and these rides had become the particular rhythm of their days, the time when the valley was new and the light was horizontal, and they talked or didn't talk and both were content either way. In July she told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning before the ride, because she had woken up knowing and had not wanted to wait. He was in the kitchen with his coffee, and she came in and sat down across from him and said, "I think by February." He looked at her and she watched him work through it and arrive at understanding, and the expression that landed on his face then was one she felt all the way through her. "February," he said. "Around then, maybe January. Dr. Harmon will know better." He set down his coffee very carefully and came around the table and pulled her up out of her chair and held her for a very long time, not dramatically, just completely, with the full weight of his intention and his joy. "Thank you," he said, which was an unusual thing to say, but she understood what he meant. "Thank you," she said back. Margaret, when told, said good, in a tone that suggested she had been expecting this and had thoughts about the nursery that she would be sharing shortly. Santos, when told, said nothing for a moment and then said, "This valley is good for children. They come up strong here." Pete said he would teach the baby to ride before it could walk, which John vetoed on sight. Carver said congratulations and shook John's hand and looked pleased. The autumn was warm and golden, and slow in the way that the best autumns are, the aspen turning on the slopes and the air carrying that specific clarity that comes before the cold sets in. Eva continued teaching until October, when the mornings became too cold for the walk to the church, and then moved the school to the warm room of the ranch house, which Margaret supervised with the air of a general overseeing troop movements. She was enormous by December and comfortable in her largeness in a way she had not expected, as though her body had decided that this was the right use of all the space it had been conserving. John was attentive without being anxious, which she appreciated enormously, attentive in the practical sense, making sure the path to the outhouse was cleared every morning, appearing with hot water before she asked for it, riding to fetch Dr. Harmon for a preliminary visit in November to confirm everything was proceeding correctly. Dr. Harmon, a compact, sardonic man of 60 who had been practicing in Garnet Creek for 7 years, and who had delivered most of the valley's current crop of children, pronounced everything in good order and told her to come and get him when the time was actually upon her and not before, and told John with a certain dry humor to stop looking as though he was preparing for battle. "It happens every day," Dr. Harmon said. "Not every day here," John replied. "Fair point," said the doctor. The baby came on January 15, 1880, in the deep cold of a clear sky winter night, when the stars over the valley were so bright they seemed to make a sound. It was a long night and a hard one in the particular demanding way of first births, and Margaret was present throughout in the capacity of someone who had done this before, and communicated that fact with a calm authority that Eva found more useful than anything else. John was in the hallway, which she knew because she could hear him pacing, and because twice she heard Margaret open the door and say something to him in a low voice, and then close it again. The baby came at 4 in the morning, and it was a boy, red-faced and emphatic about his arrival. And when Dr. Harmon put him in her arms, she looked at the face of her son and understood something she had not been able to imagine before. Something about the particular gravity of a new person, the weight of them, and the lightness of them simultaneously. John came in when the doctor opened the door, and he crossed to her and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby and then at her with an expression that undid every last thing she had ever armored herself with, which at this point was very little but still. "Hello," he said, to both of them or either of them. "Hello," she said. "He looks like he has opinions," John said. "He comes by that honestly," she said. They named him Edmund William Wallace, Edmund for John's father and the complicated inheritance of him, William for Eva's father, the gentle, methodical man who had called her little lawyer. Margaret, who was not a crier, removed herself from the room shortly after this decision was announced, and could be heard in the kitchen doing things with considerably more force than was strictly necessary. Edmund was a good baby in the sense that he had a strong constitution, and a loud, clear way of expressing his needs, and a face that, within 2 weeks of arriving, had won the devoted allegiance of every person on the ranch. Santos sat with him in the morning sometimes while Eva taught, holding him with the practiced ease of someone who had held many children, and spoke to him in Navajo and in Spanish and occasionally in English, apparently on the theory that it was never too early. Pete, despite the veto on riding before walking, could be found in the evenings making horses from wooden blocks and narrating their movements to the baby, who regarded him with the serious, intent gaze of someone who intended to evaluate the information later. Spring came again and Eva returned to teaching, and the valley resumed its seasonal life, and the ranch expanded further with a good calf crop and a fair price at the summer drive. And the days had the quality that the best days have, of being worth fully inhabiting. In the evenings she and John sat on the porch with Edmund between them, in the way that the evenings had settled into, the baby growing from something that required constant management into something that watched the mountains with evident and growing interest, and the valley going gold and blue in the late light, and she held the feeling consciously, deliberately, the way you hold something precious without squeezing it. "What are you thinking?" John asked one evening in April, the kind of spring evening that has warmth in it for the first time and smells of river water and new grass. "I'm thinking about seasons," she said. He looked at her. "I spent 3 seasons running," she said. "Spring and summer and autumn, and then I came here in the 4th and it caught me. I didn't expect to be caught." She looked at Edmund, who had fallen asleep against her side with the total commitment to sleep that babies have. "I'm thinking about how strange it is that running taught me what I was running toward, that the only way to end up here was to have come through all of that." John was quiet for a moment. "Do you wish it had been different?" "I wish the judge hadn't died," she said. "I wish there was a way to have done what needed doing without 3 years of fear." She looked at him. "But I don't wish I'd never run, because the running is what brought me here, to this valley." "To you?" He reached over and took her hand, and she leaned her head against his shoulder in the way she had in the wagon in December more than a year ago, and he put his arm around her and around Edmund, and the porch held all of them in the last of the April light. "This valley," he said softly, "has a way of keeping the people it wants." "I noticed," she said. "I'm glad I let it." The 2nd year and the 3rd built on the 1st in the way that good years build, each one adding something to the total weight of what they were making together. The school grew until it had 23 children, and Eva was corresponding regularly with the Territorial Education Office about a proper schoolhouse, which she fully expected to have by 1882, and in the meantime was conducting classes in the church's main room with the full permission of the circuit preacher, who had met Eva once and concluded promptly that she knew what she was doing. John expanded the ranch again in the spring of 1881, bringing on 2 additional hands and adding a new barn that Santos helped design and that Carver led the construction of, and the Wallace spread became one of the larger and more consistently profitable operations in the valley, a fact that John held without vanity, which was one of the things she loved most about him. Edmund walked at 11 months and talked at 14, and his first clear word was neither mama nor papa but horse, which settled the question of certain priorities early. By his second spring, he was following Santos around the property with the intent purposefulness of a child who has identified a person of interest, and Santos bore this with the patience and quiet affection that he brought to everything. Eva's school received its formal territorial recognition in the autumn of 1881, along with a budget for books and the promise of a permanent building the following spring. And when the letter arrived, she read it at the kitchen table and then went and found John in the south pasture and told him and watched his face do that thing she loved, that quiet, deep pleasure. "You built something," he said. "We built something," she said, gesturing at the valley generally, meaning all of it. In February of 1882, Edmund was 2 years old and already convinced that the world was designed for his particular investigation, and Eva told John that they were expecting again, this time she thought in late summer. He received this with the same quality of joy as the first time, that specific fullness, though this time without the particular edge of unfamiliarity, this time simply as the addition of something more to what was already abundant. The summer of 1882 was the hottest in Redemption Valley anyone could remember, the heat coming down into the high country in a way that was unusual, and that made the river run lower and the cattle move to shade in the afternoons, and made everyone drink considerably more water than usual. Eva delivered their second child on a hot August night in 1882, a girl this time, who arrived with less ceremony than Edmund, but with no less conviction about her presence. They named her Clara Margaret Wallace, Clara for the cover name Eva had used in Dodge City, and that she had carried without realizing. She was also carrying the possibility of giving it to someone she loved, and Margaret for the woman who had kept the house and kept counsel, and kept her feelings largely to herself while doing both, and who received the naming with the expression of a person who had been surprised, and was not going to acknowledge the surprise but was clearly very moved by it. Clara was, from the beginning, a child who observed. Where Edmund had been emphatic and loud, Clara was watchful and precise, and she looked at the world with her mother's particular quality of attention and her father's steadiness. And she was, in the opinion of everyone on the ranch, an exceptional person from the start. Edmund, at 2 years old, received his sister with the solemn importance of a boy who had been told this was a significant matter and took the assignment seriously. He brought her things, small stones, a feather, once a small frog that caused a variety of reactions from the adults present, and regarded her with a proprietary affection that endured. Santos said, watching Edmund watch Clara one afternoon, "He will take care of her. It is already decided." "Yes," Eva agreed. "I think you're right." The schoolhouse was built in the spring of 1882 as promised, a proper timber building with real windows and a wood stove and a map on the wall that Eva had ordered from a publisher in Denver, the world spread out in all its geography. She spent the first morning in it alone before school began, standing at the front of the empty room with the chalk in her hand, and the morning light coming through the new windows, and she thought about her mother in the schoolroom in Ohio, and about the woman who had been a fugitive in Kansas and New Mexico, and who had ridden into this valley not planning to stop. She thought about how the self is not a fixed thing, about how 3 years of running had stripped away everything that was not essential, and had left something purer and harder and more honest, and about how this valley had taken that essential thing and given it room to become something larger. She wrote on the board, "This is where we begin." Then she erased it because it was too personal for a classroom opening, and she wrote instead the date in the large, clear script she had learned from her mother. The children arrived. School began. John came to walk her home at the end of the day and found her locking the door, Edmund on her hip, and he took the boy from her and offered her his free arm, and she took it, and they walked home through the late afternoon in the spring light. The valley opened around them in all its familiar beauty, the mountains holding the light as they always did, the river running as it always had, the smoke from the ranch house chimney rising straight up into the still air. "Good day?" he asked. "Very good day," she said. Edmund behaved for Margaret. Edmund, who understood more than he was always given credit for, said Santos with the air of a full explanation. "Ah," said John, "of course." They came home to the ranch in the early evening, to the smell of supper and the sound of Clara finding her voice in the cradle in the warm room, and Pete and Carver, already cleaned up and at the table, and Santos coming in from the porch, and Margaret moving between the stove and the table with the precise efficiency of someone who had been keeping this household for years. They sat down, all of them. The long table with all its people, and the fire and the supper, and the mountains going purple through the windows, and the baby's voice and the boy's questions, and the particular, irreplaceable texture of a life fully inhabited. Eva looked at John down the length of the table, and he looked at her with that direct, warm attention, and she understood, not for the first time but perhaps most clearly in that moment, that this was what she had been running toward without knowing it, that all 3 seasons of flight had been not escape but approach, not retreat but the long way around to the place where she was meant to stop. She had stopped running. She had stopped in this valley, in this house, at this table, with this man and these children and these people who had become, without fanfare or formal declaration, her people. She picked up her fork. She sat in the warmth of everything that was hers, and she was home. 3 years later, in the autumn of 1885, when Edmund was 5 and Clara was 3, and there was a new baby coming the following spring that John said they needed to discuss names for before she made unilateral decisions again, which made her laugh until she had to put her coffee down. Eva Rhodes Wallace stood on the porch of the ranch house in the early morning and watched the valley receive the season's first real snow. It came the way the first snow always came in the high country, overnight and earnest and deep, and the valley was white and still, and the mountains were close and white, and the river cut its dark thread through the silence, and the smoke from every chimney in the valley below was rising in straight lines into the clear, cold air. She had a letter in her hand from an attorney in St. Joseph, the last administrative trailing edge of the Holt case, confirming that Gerald Holt had died in prison the previous month, quietly, of a respiratory illness, and that the case files were being officially sealed and archived. The letter was a formality. The matter had been finished for years, finished in the deep ongoing way of a thing resolved rather than just ended. She folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket and stood in the snow and looked at the valley. John came out behind her with 2 cups of coffee and handed her one and stood beside her. "Letter from St. Joseph," she said. "I saw." She took the coffee. "It's done. Completely." "Good," he said. They stood together in the first snow of the season, looking at the valley they had made their life in, the ranch and the school and the people and the children who were still sleeping upstairs in the warmth, and the mountains that had been there before all of it and would be there long after, holding this pocket of the world in their patient, permanent arms. She had spent 3 seasons running from her past until this valley had made her want to stop running. She had stopped. And everything she had found when she stopped, the man, the land, the work, the children, the particular deep root of choosing and being chosen, had made the running and the stopping and everything between both entirely worth it. The snow fell. The coffee was warm in her hands. The valley was quiet and white and fully, permanently, beautifully hers. She leaned against John's shoulder. He put his arm around her. and the morning opened.